to establish the special measures, the budgets, the programs, the platforms on which we can respond. Governments also have a critical role to play in communication and trust building. The countries that have succeeded best or have fared worse have often not principally something to do with the wealth status or the financial resources alone, although they are critical, but with the way that they're able to establish trust with the population, so governments and people are acting as one. And thirdly, in government and governance, international cooperation is critical. When there is a risk of a pandemic, there is no country that can act in isolation. So investing in partnerships in the neighborhood, engaging in international mechanisms, critical. A third area is people. People have to believe in the ability of a society to act cohesively and collectively. Equality, fairness, transparency, but also looking to people for solutions. Very often there is no perfect response. We need to learn from how people are able to stand up in their communities. Sometimes in the worst moments that we have in the pandemic, such as the one we've just lived through or are living through, is to also see how communities organize, how people rise up to the challenge to work together. Fourthly, innovation. We in a moment of crisis have to look at all sorts of possibilities. The experience with digitalization is just one lens through which we have learned a lot. And I think at that moment, essentially governments have to pivot forward. The private sector has to bring solutions to the foreground, and citizens are part of co-evolving a response that allows both at local community level, but then at a national level to succeed. And finally, if it is linked to climate change, as you also said, then again, the urgency of transformation, of in the midst of a crisis, not only to manage a crisis, but to think about how do you work with your neighboring countries? How do you look at those drivers of climate change that you can, out of this crisis, change so that resilience ultimately becomes a way forward? So these are perhaps 5 ways in which to think about how you respond. And whether it is in the Arab region, whether it is in other parts of the world, there are common areas, but there are also very distinctive ones. They may have to do with culture, with education, with economic resources. That obviously depends from country to country, but these are perhaps 5, let's say, variables that have proven critical in a moment of multiple crises and stress, particularly when it comes to the danger of a pandemic. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thanks a lot, Achim. Khalida, I would like to direct this question and the 5 minutes into the future scenario to you. What is your response and how do you think about innovation in this scenario?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. It's difficult to speak after Achim, as I was saying earlier in a private conversation, but I don't want to repeat, but we will take into consideration the lessons learned. What have we learned? Besides the fact that we need science, for sure, we need innovation as well. We learned that we need to be fast, we need to be agile. So what I will do, I will immediately call upon the expertise that we have built during this pandemic and reactivate the cross-cutting agile support team that we have built first. We will contribute to slowing the spread of the disease and focus on the most vulnerable. And we know that the region has a lot of vulnerable people, women, refugees, IDPs, youth, disabled people. Second, the other thing that I wanted to come back to what Achim said is about innovation. In UNDP, we have across our countries Accelerator labs that we consider as the think tank for innovation. And crises, as much as they are challenges, also present opportunities to think out of the box. And for sure, we have learned that business as usual is not an option. My third and last point, so I stick to the time, is the need to work together. There is no one agency, as Achim was saying, that can do it by itself, or a government. And the role of the civil society is very important, the private sector. So we need to be inclusive, including women and youth, and build solutions that are grown at home. So we don't impose on the population solutions that are not adapted to the context. And we have seen that by involving all the partners, donor countries, local communities, national government, private sector, scientists, etc., this has made the difference in the way that UNDP has responded to COVID-19 efforts. And I hope we will not have another pandemic to close. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Really clear and succinct. And as the next panelist, I'd like to invite Maya to respond to this scenario. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, everyone. Happy International Women's Day. I think I would start by saying that there is a big challenge of the COVID-19 and gender equality and women's empowerment at large, and this is a must for requiring and thinking innovatively. We need transformative shifts, we need integrated approaches, we need a bold new innovative solutions for women, especially that the COVID had put on their shoulders more and more burden. We were talking about unpaid care work and double or triple burden of women. Right now, it's hundreds of burdens on the shoulders of women, having the children staying at home. She has to work from home. All this needs an innovative solution. Aside with this as well, increasing mentorship platforms, increasing e-learning platforms for women, mobile banking, other solutions that would help minimize the burden is also a must. Innovation is interesting, is important, but we should focus that it has to be a rule of inclusion women into the innovative approach and the innovative cycle, and as well post examples and role models of women all around the world that has succeeded in innovative solutions to minimize the burden and minimize the burden of others. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maya. And Basma, all three of our previous panelists have talked about the importance of local solutions. You work as the head of solutions mapping. Really curious to hear perspectives on this scenario.
Thank you, Ben, and good afternoon, and happy International Women's Day. Now, jumping right into this scenario, I was having a conversation about this with Jennifer Colville, our head team leader of innovation, and this is a regular Tuesday for UNDP Sudan, or in our case, it's a regular Monday. Our context is a context of crisis. It's protracted crisis, it's compound crisis. You know, this year alone, we started with acute watery diarrhea, into COVID, into floods, and now the refugee crisis that's happening in the East. So when it comes to innovation and the context of innovation within a crisis for such a specific scenario, it's the problem solving is the heart of innovation. And it's the innovators that are jumping in and leaning in to help. Crisis presents us with such unique conditions that allow innovators to do things differently, to move freely, to create rapid change. And this is exactly what we're noticing on the ground. A whole of society collective approach of problem solvers, leaning in with almost a united around a purpose, united around this crisis to solve it. So let me give you a few examples of such things. You know, we've had university labs that have shifted with their students to produce hand sanitizers for free. You know, we've seen promotional merchandise businesses that were using their 3D printers in order to produce face masks. We saw social enterprises organizing a collective of tailors that would then produce face masks. We saw youth homestay startups that were completely pivoted in order to that pivoted their business so that the host families could then host frontline health workers. And this is exactly what we saw, and this is what we do here at the Accelerator Lab as a solution mapper, to really deep dive, to have a reach out to these networks, these wealth of solution holders, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and bringing that back into the table to ensure that the decision makers are enabling, scaling, supporting these such such solutions that are already happening, that are context specific, that are also that context specific and context appropriate. So this is what we are doing here, what we did with COVID-19, and this is what we will continue doing in the future scenario that you just presented. Over.
Thanks a lot, Basma. Really exciting work by your team and the Accelerator Lab network in general. I'd like to also now welcome Mr. Popowski. Welcome to today's conversation on compounded crises. We already started with introductions, including your introduction and the panelists, and already responded to the initial question, which I would like to direct to you now. It's about the scenario where, imagine today's situation with nearly not all of humanity being immunized against COVID-19 and humanity coping with interdependent crises, climate change, gender inequalities, and of course, COVID-19. And now you're receiving a briefing of yet another virus emerging, most likely linked to climate change, which has the potential to transform into a new pandemic. And we would like to know, in a 2-minute response, what are your actions and how do you think about innovation in this context? Mr. Popowski, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for joining late, and happy Women's Day. Indeed, there was a hiccup, which means that we still need to work on our own innovative agenda. Look, I'm not going to repeat everything that has been said, but indeed, we now have a new framework in place, which is the new agenda for the Mediterranean, where we are drawing lessons from the current pandemic and trying to grasp the momentum of the recovery. I mean, the post-COVID recovery, all aspects of it. Also linking it up with our own agenda in the European Union, being the green and digital transition, economic recovery, and also dealing with irregular migration or forced displacement. And within this new agenda, we are going to put a lot of emphasis on resilience, economic development, youth, and skills, and innovation certainly plays an important role in this context, both in terms of policy planning and strengthening institutional structures and developing a mechanism. And this is what should help us in case of any future emergency, if we really invest in people and we invest in robust institutions. For instance, health system institutions, they certainly need a lot. Also in Europe, it's not an isolated phenomenon. So we are really going to focus on that. We are not coming empty-handed, because the new agenda for the Mediterranean comes with an economic and investment plan, where we have foreseen up to 7 billion euros that we would put forward, that should spur long-term growth and social economic recovery and generate investment that certainly benefit both the people and the institutions in the countries. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Rich conversation so far, and what really stood out to me were the points on the centrality of innovation, but the importance to really embed it in transformation. And that goes along with imagining new systems. And the second was the focus on people and a local solution. And picking up a point that Achim made, and I take the liberty to paraphrase, is to think about the agency of people. And that reminds me of a really important context in working on gender equality, which is leveraged by development organizations and feminist organizations, thinking about different forms of power, not only power over, but first power within. I have an agency, no matter how marginalized I might be structurally in an organization. The power to and the power with in the collective to move solutions forward. An essential ingredient in moving feminist agendas forward and working towards women's empowerment, but also an essential ingredient in advancing local solutions with the support of UNDP and other partners. So thanks a lot for those short responses and staying on time. for this first scenario question. And now I'd like to go over to our initial set of questions for the panelists. And I invite the audience to put questions forward for the second part of the conversation. Once my questions are asked to the panelists, we will bring forward questions from the audience. So please put them in the chat function. And for the first question, I would like it to direct it to you, Achim. Today, obviously, the world is characterized by compounded crises. And as governments and development organizations, we don't have the luxury to address them either in isolation or sequentially, but rather we have to focus on how to best prioritize and address crises that are interdependent and interrelated. What we're really curious about to hear from you is, how is UNDP changing its approach to respond to these compounded crises?
Let me begin where Basma left off, because I think, we talk a lot about systemic solutions, complexity, multiple crises, and I think in one sense, it speaks to the challenge of managing complexity and to understand how systems respond and interact. I mean, when you have a pandemic, you have a health crisis, but you also have an economic systems crisis, you have a potential social and even political crisis. So that's one end of the spectrum, sometimes somewhat abstract, but what Basma was pointing to just now, and that's been at the forefront of our way of trying to reinvent the way we can be a useful partner to countries in UNDP. If you want to do things differently, you first have to learn to see things differently. And we often underestimate that whether it is a rural community, farmers, a farming household, whether it is a woman entrepreneur, a head of household, these are systems managers. They are managing systems every day. And part of what we try to do when we put in place the Accelerator Labs, which built on this notion that, in development, innovation is essentially the daily bread of our work, whether you're a government minister, whether you're a social entrepreneur, whether you are a business person or a community leader, you're constantly trying to think of how can we address issues such as poverty, structural inequality in better ways. The Accelerator Labs that UNDP put in place, initially 60, now there's over 92, I think, covering more than 100 countries, were a deliberate effort to put in place a lens with which we could look for solutions within a society, try to understand their systemic approach, and then be able to also work with government to look at what are the obstacles? Why are people struggling with their ingenuity, their entrepreneurship? Because maybe government regulations are not there. Simple things like access to internet and broadband. In this day and age, clearly there is a fundamental opportunity, but if you don't have the infrastructure, all the ingenuity cannot succeed. But also addressing in a crisis vulnerability. Maya and others spoke to it also earlier on. When you look at particularly women households, and we've just published on the occasion of International Women's Day, another analysis of how women are disproportionately affected in employment terms, in the economic, socioeconomic impacts. We need to be able to identify with a community and within a community those who are most vulnerable. Then you need to put in place perhaps completely new ways of thinking about stabilizing a crisis. The proposal by UNDP last year to introduce a temporary basic income in order to enable particularly poor people to actually have the ability to maintain a lockdown in one form or another to contain the virus was a way of recognizing that you had to think out of the box. So for UNDP, it's still a matter of sometimes very complex economic policy analysis, multidimensional poverty indicators, but it is also about learning from within a society where people every day manage reality as a systems response, and then extrapolate from that ways in which we can help to create better conditions for people to succeed. And that is changing the way that I think UNDP looks at both development and the role of a development program such as UNDP in working with a nation, a community, practitioners, the business sector. And that, I think, is where suddenly acceleration, that's why we use the term acceleration also. Innovation is very much part of it, but it's not an end in itself. At the end of the day, we want to accelerate the transitions, the transformations, poverty eradication, access to opportunities, financial inclusion. These are the drivers of development. They require innovation, but they also require a deep understanding of where people are living, operating, making decisions today, and thereby extrapolate where development policy can make a difference. Back to you, Benjamin.
Thanks a lot, Achim. And point well taken that innovation needs to be a means to get to outcomes, requires directionality, particularly as we see more and more evidence emerging on the exacerbation of inequalities through successful innovation that doesn't have the right directionality. Thanks a lot. Mr. Popowski, I'd like to ask the next question to you. Building on what Achim just said, that essentially the way we thought about designing this world and systems will not get us to designing systems that are suitable for the future. And we would love to hear from you, what kind of thinking should development practitioners leave behind to get to the change that we want to see and design sustainable systems that can deal with compounded crises? Over to you.
Benjamin, I think he dropped out.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just was informed that due to technical difficulty, he's no longer with us. Apologies for that. Now, I wonder if although this question was meant for our colleague from the EU, I might direct it to you, Basma, initially for some thoughts on what kind of thinking should we leave behind?
Thank you so much, Ben, for that one. What I can say, or what I can tell you that is happening live right now or currently within UNDP is the exact same question, attempting to answer the exact same question that you're posing here. The Accelerator Lab with the Crisis Bureau is right now developing an innovation framework for crisis and in crisis and fragility settings. And the purpose of that is to really look at cross-pollination of methods, hacks, tools, methodologies that are enabling and supporting doing things differently within UNDP, within these settings that are, and the complexity of these settings that we are dealing with. So what is ultimately happening is, as the sort of drivers of development, you know, the Accelerator Lab, we have one heck of a job. You know, we're mandated to be creative, to do things differently, and this is very much in our job description. Now, taking that learning that we are sharing amongst each other as a network, how we can then support our colleagues across UNDP to, in practical ways, to implement that in their everyday jobs or in their everyday work. So in a way, what we would like to, particularly when we're looking at, you know, contexts, whether it's compound or protracted, it's pretty much enabling cross-learning, but it's what we're also hoping that this is a learning journey at the end of the day. The nature of crises is consistently changing. And just by virtue of continuous sharing and continuous cross-engagement across regions, across teams, this is pretty much what we would hope to leave behind, an organization that is continuously learning and building on that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Basma. And as Mr. Popowski had to dial off, it's my pleasure to welcome Ingrid Schweiger to the panel. Are you there, Ingrid? Can you hear us?
Yes, indeed. Hello.
Hello. A warm welcome. It's great to have you with us. We introduced you right in the beginning of the event. So if it's okay with you, we would love to dive right into the conversation, the discussion, and ask the same question. Essentially, what kind of thinking should development practitioners leave behind to advance practices that get us into a desired future?
Thanks. I think I can come in from a specific angle because I'm working also on regional cooperation, and there it's a lot about, you know, spreading out, being as open as possible. So one of the things we definitely have to leave behind is that in the field of innovation, in the new context, you know, solutions can be found by one institution, one entity, or one level only. And what we try to do is for example, in the area of regional cooperation, using all this access to open up to networks, to establish connections, for example, between EU innovation actors and concrete actors in the region, or opening up to different stakeholders at all levels. So I think that's one key point. What else to leave behind in the thinking? It's also to see innovation as only an economic or technical issue. And I think there's very interesting scope to work in the future on everything linked to social innovation. And that's related also to working with completely new stakeholders. For example, we started to work a lot at region level on the field of social economy. And they're using enterprises, young enterprises, also to come with a different objective to solutions, that it's not only to solve an issue, but at the same time to have a very positive impact on society. And I think having this people-centered approach for the future and thinking of every action, how can it be structured? How can innovation be structured? That it not only is at the benefit of an individual entrepreneur or whatever, but that the positive impact comes back to society. And there is a lot out there, to develop further. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Ingrid. And if you have the opportunity to activate your camera, it'd be fantastic to also have you with us via video.
Sure.
Perfect. Welcome again. It's good to see you.
Good seeing you. Thanks.
Before going on to the next question for Maya, I just would like to ask if any other panelists would like to come in and with a short thought on what should we leave behind. Khalida, I see you raising your hand.
Well, maybe not to answer what we will leave behind, but to react to what was said by the colleague from the EU about innovation not being technical. Because very often when we speak about innovation, we think a wow solution like digitalization, something but it can be as simple as, I don't know, I worked in the rural sector, so drip irrigation can be an innovation. A process can be an innovation, because innovation is here to accompany the countries to evolve into their development, to face challenges and changes. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Khalida. And if I don't see any hands raised, I will go to the next question, but just saying thank you to Ingrid and Khalida for making points that resonate. Personally working in innovation quite a bit. I do ask myself if we might not be too influenced by Silicon Valley paradigms when we think about innovation, essentially as a technical, usually win-win scenario. And today at International Women's Day particularly, we have to reflect on power, on shifting norms, and very often that entails productive struggles, but it entails struggles, and that's not always a win-win. Shifting towards a zero carbon economy will entail a lot of wins and opportunities for the economy, but it will shift to a degree who benefits from what's currently the status quo. So expanding our understanding of innovation, that it's not necessarily always a win-win, but it can be. Innovation can be very technical, important incremental improvements, embedded in large, as Achim said, directive, transformative endeavors is really important, and really can and should be both. So really important to investigate how we understand innovation, what are the dominant paradigms, how they influence the development sector. For the next question, Maya, I'd like to pick up on your earlier comments when you outlined how the COVID pandemic and its direct and indirect impacts are affecting women disproportionately and exacerbating essential gender inequalities and the very often hidden crises women and girls are facing. And essentially looking at innovation, we'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think innovation can accelerate positive impact towards gender equality. And as a related question, how do you see the role of women as innovators in their communities, in their nations? Maya, you're on mute. If you could kindly unmute yourself.
Sorry, Ben. Would answer the last question first, which is related to women and innovation. We have to highlight that women still represent a minimum representation in the STEM at large and the scientific research in the world. And even if we are a minority within this sector, if we have role models, it's not highlighted in the right way. So we pave the way or give good examples for other generations to follow. And when we talk about gender equality and women's empowerment in innovation, it should not be a cherry on the top. It should be throughout the whole cycle, from the thinking of the problem to the implementation. To, as what Khalida said, it's very important. It might be a very simple solution that did not come into the direction of scientists, but it would have been very easy for a rural woman in Upper Egypt to give us a small solution that would really end her challenge that she is facing every day. So it's very important to ensure that gender is mainstreamed from the needs on the ground to the solution that would be presented to women as well. Of course, use behavioral insights and positive deviance as approaches that can help scale successful behaviors or strategies is also could be handled through innovation, and especially when we tackle COVID and domestic violence. In Egypt, it was very important to help women to report immediately or to report in the general prosecutor without leaving their homes if they are facing domestic violence. And it was an innovative solution for a very simple, it might be easy to have a website or an email for the general prosecutor office that we never thought of. But in the pandemic, it was as easy as this. Also, in the mentoring platform for the period of the confinement was important. Mobile banking, because women were not going out of their house. E-learning platforms, digital village saving and lending groups, moving from a group of women, rural women saving or lending each other in the house. It was very important to think of a digitalized solution and an innovative solution to help them collect their money, lend their money without meeting in person. And we launched as well or continue the work of the social innovation hubs that has been supported kindly by the UNDP in all governorates of Egypt, having technology as part of the learning processes for women with the Ministry of Communication, and having the Qudwa Tech solution. Women with disabilities in innovation and assistive technologies was also something that we have to think of, thanks to UNDP and bringing this on board. It's very important. Disabled women were also the highly affected during the pandemic. At large, it's important to think what women want at the end, and whether the solution is really responsive to their demands. Accelerating the responses is even a must in the COVID pandemic, and the new normal that women are facing is really tough. They have a lot of burden again, and we need to think innovatively, bringing solutions to their hands and helping them to overcome this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. Before going on to the next question, I wonder if other panelists would like to chip in on particularly the question on how can innovation help accelerate impact towards gender equality. Achim, please.
Can I come in briefly? Because I think one theme that is important in our conversation this morning is that innovation can be as much about the next software solution, the next platform, the next technology breakthrough. And I would again say that, you know, in many ways, technology is a phenomenal enabler. And yet it is always in the, you know, beyond the invention of such an opportunity, ultimately successful or not successful if it is embedded in an ecosystem that you also have to shape. I mean, if you take the whole digitalization universe today, you know, when it began 20 years ago, getting a free email address from a provider and then, you know, being able to communicate with the whole world without paying a penny was something that, you know, seemed to be revolutionary. 20 years later, you know, we have learned that in order for these businesses to run on that business model, our data, our information, our emails are scanned, sold as data packages, you know, 1,000 times over. And it's a business model that has raised fundamental questions about privacy, about the right to our data. So I think, in the way that we first of all look at technology, it is, creating extraordinary opportunities. Just take financial inclusion. Women today are in their tens of millions able to interact with a financial system that they were simply excluded of in the past. And so smartphones, the platforms, the payment systems, the cash transfer systems are even at a point today where with artificial intelligence, you can borrow money in the morning in a country like Kenya on your smartphone to buy goods in wholesale, take them to your local market, sell them and repay the loan in the evening. In West Africa, we are learning a lot also from women traders there. So the opportunity of technology is undeniable. How you shape ultimately its benefit, and does it increase or decrease inequality? How do you account for the fact that some people do not have the capital to invest to participate in that new economy? These are the questions where public policy becomes critical. And so sometimes it may be technology that is the driver of innovation. Sometimes it is a purpose, an objective. Gender equity, dealing with, for example, girls staying at school, access to finance. These are public policy challenges that require innovation, where technology becomes a part of it, but it is the way we think about introducing them and with what focus. So again, the temporary basic income report we just launched, looking at women in this pandemic, is an attempt not to so much look at the technology and the software end of it. It's because software and technology have enabled us to identify those women far more effectively, to put in place a cash transfer program that could reach them directly in a matter of weeks to be set up, that we then try to tackle what Maya just spoke to. This pandemic has hurt women disproportionately, continues to hurt them, will continue to hurt them for months, if not years to come, because of the economic impact. How do you then design a crisis response in a pandemic that is, applying a gender lens, leveraging technology, using public policy, including a government that is willing to put budgets behind these kinds of schemes? That is innovation at work in the midst of a pandemic with a gender lens and leveraging technology. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Achim. That very much resonates together with Maya's. And I'm going to take the liberty to just reflect on one point, starting with an insight from the private sector and companies that successfully innovate. And in addition to many of the known ingredients, what constitutes successful innovation and advance it internally, one key factor is emotional safety. Do employees feel safe to risk, to take experiments, share what works? And I would argue, personally, I've encountered this in advancing innovation for gender equality in international organizations. It's really important to have the communities meet, but provide support to innovators who've been working on gender equality, who had to defend their positions, defend their budgets working on gender equalities over decades. And it's not easy to then challenge colleagues with innovation. So establishing not only emotional safety, but allyship, really important. But the same goes to public policy that Achim mentioned. How can we think of establishing elements such as dignity and safety in digital environments for women to leverage digital opportunities? How can we establish that in nodes of the ecosystem that Achim mentioned? Access to financing, access to mentorship support for women and girls to unfold their potential. And how can we as international organizations engage with innovators who might not have organizational entity designs that we usually engage with, doesn't speak our technical language, but really leverage their approaches. That's why the Acceleration Lab network is such a promising initiative, trying to do exactly that, among other things. So thanks a lot for that, Achim. I would now like to ask the next question to Khalida. And this essentially starts with the assumption that a lot of colleagues, a lot of decision makers in international development see innovation as a luxury, as a nice to have. And we would like to hear from you in terms of development organizations. How can they leverage approaches of innovation to really elevate their game, to bring relevant, credible, and useful thinking to the forefront of international development, particularly in times of compounded crises?
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I mean, first of all, the answer is a big yes, a clear yes, but you might ask me why I'm saying that. Let me explain to you briefly. Because moments of crisis are moments of choice. In times of uncertainty, when there is no clear path forward, I believe it's our joint responsibility to imagine and experiment with different ways of doing, and to work with those who step up to take that risk. As we were saying, you need risk taker. So as I said before, for us, there is no room for business as usual. We need to consider innovation as a process that accompanies countries in their path to adapt to evolving contexts and crises, to enable them to reach the SDGs, of course, but to reduce the increasing inequalities. In the Arab region, the inequalities have increased tremendously after COVID-19, and now as we speak, we have almost 25% of the population that will live under the poverty line of the country. Second point I wanted to make is a principle. Innovation is a fungible concept. And for me, what is innovative for one context can be obsolete in another context. I mentioned the case of drip irrigation. It can be anything. The second point I wanted to make is about the affordability of innovation. We need to make sure we work in developing countries that the innovation that we are promoting have ownership of the local communities and the government, but also are affordable for poor people. The most exciting innovation I would like to mention is about digitalization. We have seen overnight that it has been accelerated by COVID-19. And if COVID-19 had a positive impact, is this one. So everything from track tracing to online grocery shopping, to access to market, to access to financing, this has been possible immediately through innovative solutions. I want to mention, maybe to give you a few examples so you understand what I'm talking about. In Iraq, for example, we launched a spatial data infrastructure system to provide decision makers with a situational analysis tool, and together with a GIS, Geographic Information System dashboard, that was enabling them a complete analysis of the cases of COVID and recoveries, helping them to make faster decisions and also respond to appropriate measures while staying safe and at distance. They didn't need to go. So now the data is both on a web platform, mobile app, accessible to the government, researchers, academics, but also to the general public. So we are promoting also transparency by doing that. The spillover of this is very interesting because there is also an important citizen engagement element, as the GIS infrastructure provide a communication functionality through an application called the Smart Karbala, enabling the voice of citizens to be heard and considered when decisions are being made. So they can record audio and photos. So you see, we have helped the government on one side to make informed decisions, but on the other side, we have helped the citizens to be engaged and also to be heard. So while crises tend to be a push factor for needs-driven innovation, sometimes there is a risk that when the crisis is over, openness to new ideas and solution deflates, and we revert to the safe or business as usual of doing. So I would like maybe to add one example that will tell you that we are enabled to scale up our initiatives. In the case of Libya, for example, we had a partner, which is PTAR, a local application-based telemedicine startup, and the Ministry of Health, to scale telemedicine provision. So we were able to connect sick people with doctors through this application. So not only it worked in Libya, now we are talking about it across in the region of the Arab states, but beyond the border of the region, across the regional bureaus. So to give you an example that a local solution can be scaled up at the international level. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Khalida. Before I go on with another question on local innovation for Basma, are there other panelists who would like to chip in response to Khalida?
Perhaps Benjamin, just to, if you're allowed to add one aspect.
Yes, Ingrid, please go.
Okay, no, on the issue innovation, nice to have, and in times of crisis, I think during crisis it leaves us no chance but to innovate. So it really forces us, but at the same time it also opens up a lot of opportunities. And one important consideration is, and that's a bit the approach which we have been taking in the Commission, both within the EU but also in the external dimension, is to use it as an opportunity to build back better. And that involves a triple dimension, so to speak. I mean, the green transition facing the climate crisis. So to use also the emergency measures now already to work towards, the perspective of rebuilding the economy, for example, around the green economy, circular economy, working on decarbonization. So using a crisis as an opportunity to build back better, and green is one aspect. Digital, it was already mentioned before, it's partly triggered by the crisis. There was no other way for companies, for governments, for us here in this meeting than to go digital. So it's triggered by the crisis, but at the same time, we need to use it for long-term development policies, pushing digitalizations in a structured way. And the third element in that is to use the crisis as an opportunity to build back better by using the social dimension of the economy. And this is, it came up in the conversation before, but using this people-centered approach for innovation and really thinking how to bring in vulnerable groups which were so much affected by the crisis. So this using crisis to constantly build on new policies and building back better, not just short time, but with a long-term effect way beyond the crisis. That's, I think, the approach to be taken.
Thanks a lot, Ingrid. And reflecting on how you started your intervention, we have to innovate in a crisis. I think back of my own work where it's about advancing meaningful, inclusive ways of innovation. And I perceive the COVID crisis as many crises, including two specific ones. It's a confirmation crisis and an imagination crisis. The confirmation crisis is that I see when I look across governments or development organizations, people working on specific themes, seeing their themes and specific areas reconfirmed. And I don't know how useful that is. So I hold myself to account and think, let me not think about we need more innovation, but rather what do we need to stop and what tack do we need to change, not only to call for more innovation. And the imagination crisis, to really build on this crisis and try to come out better, is such an important part. And therefore, I'm also really grateful for the Istanbul Innovation Days for UNDP to think about development and its futures, to exactly bring that to the forefront, imagination. So thanks a lot for that, Ingrid. And Basma, I see you would like to come in as well. Over to you, please.
Yes, please. And I would just say, I'm echoing Ingrid's, what she has just said, 110%. It's not, the question in itself, I would say, challenge that. Innovation is not a nice to have, it's a must to have. Earlier when I spoke about how at the heart of it, innovation is about problem solving, in crisis, we are dealing with uncertainty, we're dealing with problems and multiple problems coming at us from different ways and different angles and layers. And this is where innovation comes in very strongly. Even for us at UNDP Sudan, it's also about seeing the system differently in on itself, because the crisis puts spotlight on vulnerabilities. Problem areas that where they were small, they are now even bigger. It could even, the crisis could even force us to look at problems that we may have not been aware of. And these become opportunities for innovation, or opportunities to do things differently. I'll give you an example. During COVID-19, the communication that was being put out, health-related or health-specific communication, was very much in two languages. It was in Arabic and it was in English. In Sudan, we have over 200 different ethnicities in the country. Now, when we were talking about it put a spotlight in the lack of inclusivity of information, particularly when it's as critical as health-related information. We saw local groups, what they were doing, they were recording health information in local languages. They were sending that out over WhatsApp and over Facebook. We saw videos of women on donkey carts and megaphones playing those clips, those on WhatsApp clips, and they were playing them in the village. But what that was telling you, that what we were not aware of, or the thing that the let's say the collective whole of society approach was putting a spotlight on in this specific instance, was a lack of inclusive communication. And this is what crisis does. It forces us to look at things that we are not necessarily aware of and should be building back better for. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Basma. Maya, can I hand the mic over to you, please?
Yes, thank you, Ben. I just, it really is a dream for me, and this is having innovation curriculum somehow at very young age. What we saw in the pandemic, that the younger generation and children even are thinking in a very innovative way and getting solutions, especially when the use of technology was a must, helping their elderly, helping their parents, helping people around. So I think it's extremely important if we think of an international curricula that would be led by UNDP for younger generation to understand what's meant by innovation, to help finding innovative solutions for their society. Maybe we start at an age of 18 in Egypt and with UNDP and social innovation camps, but I think it might be at earlier than the 18 years old, and having something as a manual would be also of a great importance, because this will be inclusion of young children, girls and boys, and young men and women as well. Maybe this would be also a mind changer and a social behavioral way to have an inclusion for gender equality and women's empowerment. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Maya. I saw UNDP colleagues taking notes, and Khalida, please come in.
Yeah, sorry, I know it's, I answer your question, but I have other comments. I wanted to follow up on a very important point that Achim has made. We talked about local solution, homegrown solution, but a very important thing is the unemployment rate in the region. It's the highest worldwide. Among young people, and women are doubly unemployed than men among the youth people. So Achim was saying, we are pushing for the temporary basic income. It's very important because of unemployment, but because the youth are mostly working in the informal sector. 70% of the youth in the region are working in the informal sector. Therefore, they have been hit more hard than any other part of the population. And among the 70%, there are many, many women. So we also need to push as UNDP, and this is what our administrator was saying, we need to push for local solution, for not national policies, but at the international level, we have also the duty to raise our voice to help those people who are jobless because of the crisis in the informal sector to get decent salaries in order to survive throughout the crisis, whatever crisis we are talking about. I promise I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Khalida. And this is a great segue for the next question to Basma, which is essentially what development organizations can do better to help enabling environments for thriving local innovation ecosystems.
Sure. Great question. I can tell you from what we have been doing over, say, the past past, say, year and a half, and I can start with the first one. In order to support a thriving local innovation ecosystem, you also need that ecosystem to see itself. And what I mean by that, January, and this is prior to COVID-19, yeah? So January of 2020, we had a solutions fair. And what we did there was we brought various multiple solution holders from different ecosystem islands. So the public sector, with the private sector, startups and the social enterprises, students with fascinating thesis and research. It was we had farmer radios. It was an interesting, let's say, congregation of multiple different development players from literally in one room. So it was one massive multi-purpose hall. And we literally took a step back and allowed the diffusion of ideas to take place, the cross-pollination of showcasing work, from showcasing work to cross-pollination of concepts. It allowed for partnerships to be built. It allowed for a private sector to invest in a small NGO. It allowed for a diffusion and say compound building of multiple solutions together. And this is what one of many ways that an organization or development organizations can do, is to bring those different development islands together and allow them to connect. From there is also an organizational responsibility to support, enable, even scale solutions. And this is where we walk the talk. So at UNDP Sudan, we had a solar solution in power. Fascinating. These were two founders, both under 30, met at university abroad, came back to support Sudan with a solar solution set of products. They call them solar in a box. Now, when they started, they were with us in the fair, and throughout up until now, where we have the refugee crisis taking place in the East, UNDP has been working with such a solution in order to introduce things like solar stoves, solar lighting, so on. But the different thing now that we are doing is we're looking at solar telecommunication, meaning that we're looking at telco towers that are solar powered in order to ensure that there is connectivity with the refugee population and the responses that we are having on the ground. Now, let me give you what happened. And this is real time. It happened, I was there 3 weeks ago. It was the telco company, UNDP, this solution. And what we enabled is we brought them over onto this table to showcase their brilliance as drivers of development. And what happened was we had this giant telco company almost signing a deal live between this small solution and that massive telecommunication company. And this is what we are doing here through the Accelerator Lab at UNDP, is that in order to support solution holders to shine, to be the development drivers that they are, enabling them to scale, supporting their diffusion. And that is our collective responsibility. But for development agencies, my advice is support your local ecosystems to see themselves, because the moment that they start to do so, organically they start to connect, organically they start to partner, organically they start to build with one another. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Basma. And that resonates with a lot of interventions we've heard earlier. And I'd like to provide a challenge that I'm working with other organizations on right now. While I think it's so important to try to make system dynamics visible, we have to do a better job on understanding ourselves as part of that system. We have positive and sometimes negative effects, better understand impacts of innovation investments in innovation ecosystems, for example, in Kenya, that provide mission drift and rather negative effects on social enterprises by donors through the easy access to grant funding as opposed to risk capital and distorting local innovation ecosystems. Better understanding our place as part of the system that provides meaningful funding, let's say for national health system, And if you work in a bilateral organization, potentially at the same time have your government provide pressure to open up legislation for its tobacco industry with, of course, negative impacts on the national health system. So managing us as a part of that system better as an institution and as people. And I'm trying to take the liberty to make another shout out for UNDP for its work with the Presencing Institute right now, to think about us as individuals in a system that has different effects on us and in work with local partners, and how to get the passion essentially back again for change, including radical change, and do a better job in being reflective development practitioners. I think that's great work, the collaboration with the Presencing Institute there and the points you just raised. I baked some of the questions from the audience into the question I asked the panel, and we have time for one more question, which is a rather hard one in my opinion, and I'd like to first ask Achim to respond to this. So today we're talking about compounded crises. And this is a combination of several questions from the audience, but it's essentially your reflections on what's specific about compounded crises, the layering of crises, and not being able to practically unbundle them. Could you talk about concrete approaches in response to multiple crises that address them adequately and in parallel?
I'm sometimes tempted to think that perhaps we think our time is more unique than it is. I mean, in some ways, compounded crises have been part of human lives for the better part of history. If you were, in let's say 500 years ago, a farming household, you struggled with, whether it was floods, whether it was droughts, whether it was disease, whether it was your livestock, whether it was, conflicts with your neighbors. So we humans are, in many ways, I think, have evolved, and partly why we have evolved, societal structures, governance systems, states. It is the recognition that we have to manage complexity, and particularly amongst competing interests sometimes, which are, and here we come perhaps to our age and why compounded has taken on another meaning. Some of you will have heard that we published the 2020 UNDP Human Development Report by referring to the next frontier in development and development in the age of the Anthropocene. This was a very deliberate decision, because I think where the quality of the challenge has evolved is that we now live in a world where the ability to address things locally within a community or within a nation state, and these are also evolutions over time, are being overtaken by the planetary nature of many crises, whether you want to call it globalization, whether you want to call it climate change in the atmosphere, air pollution, economic desperation, conflicts, migration. We are at a point in time where these crises that we used to be able to experience also in our very immediate context, and therefore were more resolvable with good governance, with good precautionary measures, now depend really on a humanity of 7+ billion people split up into 190+ nations. And therein lies, I think, the complexity on the one hand of managing compounded crises. The second is, and this is why we also have the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, it was that recognition that there are many risks we face today. And I often say the SDGs can also be turned upside down and are the 17 great risks of our time. And what the Agenda 2030 said, the SDGs basically says, look, we first of all need to treat them as only addressable if we work together. Ban Ki-moon, our former Secretary General, called it a declaration of interdependence, the SDGs. And secondly, and that is perhaps the recognition that you can date back 1,000 years ago in the local context, it's as true today. Integration, trying to, if you spend $1 on a crisis, make sure you're also using that dollar to invest in a way out of this crisis, to come out better, to be more resilient. So the SDGs are an unapologetic challenge to our imagination, but also to our capacity and competence to think more systemically, because we simply cannot afford, in a world of 7 billion people with these escalating crises, with time windows closing on climate change, for example, to continue to spend dollars on solving problems the way we used to. We cannot afford it, time is running out, and we need to invest on establishing a collective view of these issues, otherwise we are paralyzed in acting together. So to me, these are perhaps ways in which it's not new that we have to think in systems terms, but the complexity, the scale, the urgency have shifted the context. And that is what is so challenging for anybody who uses, let's say, the metaphor of development as essentially a series of choices we make individually, collectively as a society, and ultimately as humanity. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Achim, and powerful point on the integration among many other powerful points. And it referred back to what I heard from Khalida earlier on, when she reflected the importance of innovation investments and positive spillover effects. Also referring back to Maya, we see that supporting local ecosystems in the past on different issues had positive impact on how nations were able to cope with the COVID crisis and enabling local innovators to support them with many facets, from PPE production locally to responses to survivors of gender-based violence, with increasing rates, of course. We're almost at time. I would have loved to direct this question also to other panelists, but with apologies, I will have to now invite Khalida and then Achim for short closing remarks, as we are already almost at time. So Khalida, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was taking note where the panelists were speaking. Maybe some key messages I wanted to highlight as outcomes of this discussion. What I have heard, what I will take back, if we want to do things differently, we need to think differently. Second message, enabling learning journey as crises are continuously changing. Innovation, not only technical, but we need to think about social economy, not only to solve an issue, but have an impact on society, and to think short-term, medium-term, but also long-term. We also heard that gender mainstreaming is important, and it needs to be done from the needs on the ground to the solution. It also can be very simple and very easy and change the life of people. The other point we heard is about innovation, and Achim was saying innovation is a phenomenal enabler, and we need to be inclusive, not only of women, but the local population if we want to build back better. To build back better, we can do it in a green manner. We heard green economy, we heard renewable energy. We need to ensure that we connect that the role of the UN, I'm just thinking out loud, the role of the UN could be to help local systems, but to create national ecosystem to the international, and to connect the local system to partners in order to enable them to create opportunities. My last point is about crises are challenges, but could be opportunities, and we need to see them as an opportunity for innovation if we need to move forward, especially in the Arab region, knowing that the SDGs might not be reached if we continue business as usual. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Khalida. Also, thanks a lot for doing my job so eloquently in wrapping up the main messages. I do appreciate that. Achim, over to you for short closing remarks, please.
Well, what can I say? I think Khalida just laid it out beautifully. So I end with just one thought, which has been interesting. I recently recorded a TED Talk, and the response to that TED Talk is always interesting. Many different angles get picked up, but one thought in that resonated with many people is something that I put in a very simple phrase, which is systems don't change systems, people change systems. And I think what we have talked about this morning is to maintain within all this technology, all this complexity, macroeconomic and science and health, maintain a clear focus on people. People do matter, not just as, statistics, as poor people, or as, gender disaggregated societies. We need to recognize the potential for people to drive change, to develop solutions. Basma spoke about it. All our colleagues, Ingrid also, with the EU being a catalyst in development cooperation context, sometimes for these opportunities. So, at the end of the day, an organization like UNDP, also like any organization, is also composed of people. Our teams that are working in 170 countries around the world as partners are also changing. Our people are changing, and just bringing in a cohort of now 270 colleagues, such as Basma and others who came through the window of the Accelerator labs, many of them who would normally never have thought perhaps of working with the United Nations, coming with very unusual skill sets. That's also where you change systems, right? UNDP is a system. It needs an impulse. It doesn't mean that the Accelerator labs are the only ones who are thinking about innovation. What they give us is the capacity to have even more of a lens that views people as agents of change, from whom we learn and then connect as a global organization. Because our session today was compounded crisis adapting through innovation. It's intensely local, it's intensely global. And I see an organization like UNDP as a very privileged partner, because it can learn from the local, it is learning globally, and it can connect, when it does its job well, these universes, which is where empowerment, I think, takes place. So on that note, people matter, and people change systems. Thank you so much, Benjamin.
Thanks a lot, Achim. And before wrapping this up and thanking you, I'll pick up one point: the importance of entrepreneurs in innovation. And I want to highlight the importance of norm entrepreneurs on International Women's Day, on women and men who question paradigms and norms around gender inequalities, and the importance to deliberately invest in women entrepreneurs, in women movements who are norm entrepreneurs, with support on innovation and in partnership. But with that, thanks a lot. First of all, dear Maya, dear Ingrid, for this support of the UNDP event. Dear Achim, Khalida, and Basma, thanks a lot for the conversation today, for the excellent work of UNDP, and thanks a lot to the audience and to the organizer of this event. The conversation will continue, and the organizers will be in touch via email. And of course, please make sure to join the upcoming Istanbul Innovation Day events. Thanks a lot, everyone.